Bread is the oldest manufactured food on earth. Before cities, before writing, before anything we would recognize as civilization, humans were grinding grain and baking it against hot stone. Not because it was easy, because once you taste bread, something in you understands immediately that this was worth the effort. Every culture on earth arrived at the same conclusion independently. That tells you everything. Sourdough starts with nothing but flour and water, left out long enough to catch wild yeast from the air. The yeast ferments the sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide that inflates the dough, and lactic acid bacteria that produce the sour, tangy flavor the bread is named for. Bakers who maintain a sourdough starter are keeping something alive. Some starters in professional bakeries have been fed and sustained continuously for over a century. The bread you eat from them carries the biological history of every loaf that came before. The crust forms when the moisture on the surface of the dough escapes rapidly in a hot oven, producing the Maillard reaction, the same browning chemistry responsible for grilled meat and roasted coffee. Cracking that crust and the smell that comes out is one of the most universally recognized signals that something good is about to happen. Baguette is what happens when a culture decides that the outside of the bread is the point. Long, thin, deeply scored. The shape maximizes surface area, which maximizes crust, which maximizes flavor. French law once regulated baguette ingredients so strictly that traditional versions could only contain flour, water, salt, and yeast. No additives, no shortcuts. The scoring on top is not decorative. It controls where the bread expands during baking, directing the rise through precise cuts rather than letting the loaf split unpredictably. A baguette bought in the morning is best eaten within a few hours. By evening, it is hardened into something entirely different. The French solution to this was simply to buy bread twice a day, and millions of people still do. Ciabatta was invented in 1982. For bread, that is essentially yesterday. An Italian baker named Arnaldo Cavallari developed it specifically to compete with the baguette, which had been flooding Italian markets as French influence spread across Europe. He named it after a house slipper because of its flat, wide shape. The dough is extremely wet, almost pourable, which produces the characteristic open, irregular crumb full of large holes. Those holes are not a flaw, they are the goal. The wet dough allows carbon dioxide to expand into large bubbles rather than fine, even ones. And each hole in a slice of ciabatta holds oil, vinegar, or whatever you are dipping it into. A bread designed for dipping is a bread that understands why people eat. Focaccia precedes all of this by roughly 2,000 years. Flat, olive oil soaked, dimpled across the surface by fingertips pressed deep into the dough before baking. Those dimples hold pools of oil that keep the surface moist during baking while the bottom crisps against the pan. The Romans ate a version of this before the Roman Empire had finished constructing itself. In Liguria, the region where modern focaccia is most deeply embedded, the bread is eaten at breakfast, dunked into cappuccino, or eaten plain at the counter of a bakery before the rest of the morning begins. It is a bread so fundamental to that culture that people there feel slightly sorry for it everywhere else. Pita inflates because of physics. When dough with enough moisture enters a very hot oven, the water trapped inside turns to steam rapidly. The steam has nowhere to go and pushes the two layers of the bread apart, forming the hollow pocket that makes pita what it is. The oven must be hot enough to do this fast before the dough sets, or the steam escapes gradually and the pocket never forms. Ancient versions of this bread have been found across the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean going back thousands of years. The pocket is a relatively recent refinement. Before that, it was simply flatbread. The moment someone realized the pocket could hold food, the wrap was invented. Rye bread carries flavors that wheat bread cannot reach. Rye contains pentosans, complex carbohydrates that absorb water aggressively and produce a dense, moist crumb that stays fresh longer than most wheat breads. The earthy, slightly bitter flavor comes from compounds in the rye grain that survive milling and baking. Dark rye breads, like German pumpernickel, are baked at very low temperatures for extremely long periods, sometimes 18 hours or more. That slow bake caramelizes the natural sugars in the grain without burning them, producing a deep, almost sweet darkness and a flavor that takes years to appreciate properly. Northern European cultures built winter diets around rye for centuries because the bread lasted. It was dense enough to sustain people through cold months. And the grain grew in climates where wheat struggled. Naan belongs to the tandoor, that cylindrical clay oven, heated from the inside by charcoal or wood fire, reaches temperatures that most modern ovens cannot match. Naan dough, leavened with yeast and often enriched with yogurt or milk, is slapped directly onto the inner wall of the tandoor. It sticks. The intense radiant heat bakes the exposed surface within seconds while the contact side chars in small blisters and pulls away from the clay. The yogurt in the dough adds lactic acid that tenderizes the gluten structure, producing softness that stays even after the bread cools. Naan, without a tandoor, is technically possible. It is also noticeably different. There are things that high heat on a hot surface still cannot replicate. Injera is simultaneously the plate, the utensil, and the bread. A sourdough flatbread made from teff, an ancient grain native to Ethiopia and Eritrea, fermented for several days until intensely sour and poured onto a large flat griddle to cook in a single layer. The surface becomes porous during cooking, covered in small holes that trap sauces and stews placed on top. Diners tear pieces from the edge and use them to scoop food. Everything contacts the bread, everything absorbs into it. At the end of a meal, the injera beneath has soaked up the flavor of everything that sat on it, and eating it last is considered the best part. A food tradition where the bread improves as the meal progresses is a tradition that thought carefully about what eating is for. Croissant is laminated dough, which means it is a lie told very patiently. Layers of butter are folded into yeasted dough repeatedly, each fold creating more layers until the final structure contains dozens of distinct sheets of dough separated by thin barriers of fat. In the oven, the moisture in the butter turns to steam and the layers separate, producing the flaky, shattering exterior and the honeycomb interior that no other technique can replicate. A proper croissant requires 2 days minimum. The dough rests between folds. The butter must stay cold but pliable throughout, or the layers merge and the structure collapses. The croissant originated in Vienna, not France. French bakers adopted and refined it during the 19th century with a thoroughness so complete that everyone forgot where it started, which is possibly the most French thing in this entire story. Bagel owes everything to boiling. Before baking, the shaped dough rings are dropped into a water bath, sometimes with malt syrup or baking soda added, and simmered briefly. The boiling gelatinizes the outer starch layer before it enters the oven, setting a skin that limits oven spring and produces the dense, chewy interior the bagel is defined by. Without boiling, you get a bread roll. The boiling step is the difference between something ordinary and something irreplaceable. New York bagels became famous partly because of the water used to boil them. New York tap water has a specific mineral content that affects dough texture in ways that mattered enough to bagel makers that some bakeries in other cities began importing New York water to try to close the gap. Whether it worked remains a genuine debate, and the New Yorkers who say it does are not entirely wrong. Brioche treats dough as if it were a cake. Large amounts of butter and eggs worked into an enriched dough produce bread so tender and rich that it barely resembles the lean, utilitarian loaves that sustain people through scarcity. The fat coats the gluten strands and prevents them from tightening, which is exactly what you want for texture and exactly what makes brioche structurally fragile and quick to stale. It exists in the space between bread and pastry, used in fine kitchens for French toast, burger buns, and desserts, and eaten in France at breakfast with nothing on it at all because it needs nothing. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said to let them eat cake. The French phrase used the word brioche, not cake, which changes the story entirely. Bread tells you where people have been, what grain was available, what fuel was accessible, how much time existed, whether dairy and eggs were scarce or plentiful, whether the oven reached high heat or needed to stretch low and slow for hours. Every loaf carries the logic of the place it came from, compressed into something you can hold in your hands. That is why bread is everywhere, not because humans needed calories, because once you understand what bread can be, making it becomes an act of memory, a way of being connected to something larger than the meal in front of you. The oldest food on earth is still being made for exactly the same reason it always was. Because it works. Because it matters. Because once you have good bread, you cannot imagine going back.